Hello everyone and welcome to the Artwork Podcast. This is Jenny Danielsson and I am going to speak with Karin Hellman. She is a curator at the Getty Museum and we talk about a Swedish early photographer. In Swedish you would pronounce his name something like Oscar Rejlander. I don't really know how to say it in English, but anyway, he was born in Stockholm, Sweden, but then in the 1830s moved to the UK, and that's really when he started with photography. And Karin starts talking about what it was like to be a photographer in the 1850s. So this is really very much at the beginning of the medium of photography. I do hope you will enjoy the program. Thanks for listening.
So at that time, 1850s, photography was this new medium. It had been, announced in the late 1830s. So just a couple decades into its existence, there was still a lot of controversy about whether it was an art form, what it could do as a medium. Could it be in the same room even, or gallery as fine art, or as painting, as drawing? It was seen as very mechanical, and that because it came from a camera and not from the hand of a painter or a draftsman. But there were a lot of sort of arguments for both sides. But the 1850s was kind of remarkable in England because that was when a lot of photographic societies were forming and a lot of photographers were getting together as a collective to kind of write about and talk about their medium and what were the kind of incredible things you could do with it. What are the things that still needed to be researched? What was the future of this medium? All these questions were being battled and discussed. And so it was a very vibrant time period. And then again, still kind of open as to what was an art photograph, or is there an art photograph? So when Rejlander comes in, he's coming as an artist and bringing his background as an artist, and is sort of looking at this medium without restriction. What can I do with this new tool, and how can I play with it like I would with a painting or a drawing? He was kind of unique in that way, in that he was very creative and uninhibited by the restrictions. I think a lot of the photographers at that time were looking for sort of reasons to say no to things, or this is the way we're supposed to do things, and this is the correct kind of photography. Maybe also because he wasn't British born. He was an outsider. He was an immigrant, and he didn't necessarily need to conform to the rules that were being established.
But so did he do well?
He did, and he didn't. So that's the other interesting thing about him, is he's not this big success story. He became very well known and well liked in the sort of immediate circles he was working in. But then when he presents his 2 Ways of Life at the Manchester Art Treasures exhibition in 1857, he establishes, a name for himself, and he's definitely well known at this point, and because of that photograph, but he's also disliked by a lot of the photographic community because, again, it kind of hit at a moment when there were developing these ideas of what photography had to be or what it should do. And he was more on the path of what photography could do, possibly, and they didn't really respond to it very well because it was a different path than what a lot of photographers had been following, the idea of the photograph as being truthful to nature, and that you can imitate painting, but it can't rival it. And his 2 Ways of Life and his other combination prints were something that just hadn't been attempted on that kind of scale.
And what are those, the combination prints?
Yeah,
that comes up a lot.
Right. So
is that a technical term, or is it us afterwards saying combination print? Or
it's a technical term that was used at the time. Initially, it was called double printing. It basically meant to print multiple negatives onto one piece of paper. And he wasn't the first to do this, but he was certainly the first to do it on an epic scale and in such a kind of radical way. With the Two Ways of Life, a lot of his earlier combination prints were from 3 or 4 negatives, and the Two Ways of Life is about 32 negatives. And it was a mixture of both the technical achievement, which actually a lot of photographers responded really well to, saying, wow, this is incredible that someone could do this. But it was also the subject matter and the fact that there were these kinds of, the subject of the nude female particularly was very disturbing to a lot of the audiences. And then in addition to that, you had a lot of photographers that just didn't like the way that it looked so artificial and so crafted, because again, they were more on this line of trying to make a more naturalistic, truthful photograph. And he was making a very strong case for the fact that photography could be extremely manipulable, or can be manipulated on a scale that was probably just, they weren't ready for it. Now, of course, we don't think about it, but at the time.
It's been a while.
Yeah.
1850s to now. It's been a while. So much has happened.
Yeah.
So he worked in a studio pretty much all the time.
Yeah. And that's what's incredible is that when 1857, when he made the Two Ways of Life, his studio was a small, originally his painting studio in Wolverhampton. And that was, those kinds of constraints was initially what maybe made him sort of go overboard in terms of the composition. So he made several different negatives in the studio and then would actually scale them when he was printing them onto the sheet to even then kind of expand the space within the photograph, so that the whole composition is meant to look like it's in one room, but it's actually concocted out of or one huge space, but it's concocted in a very small space with 30 different negatives. So it's pretty incredible. And we don't need to just focus on Two Ways of Life, but because his other combination prints are remarkable too. Just the fact that he really didn't stop at the thought that photography had to be about something that actually existed. He was, sort of plowed right through that idea and went straight for, like, I could make any picture I want to, basically, and photography doesn't have to be limited to reality.
So we have to talk about his wife, because she was in the studio too. She's important. But so did he have colleagues? Do we know? Did he write about his experiments? Really?
Yeah.
Did he keep a diary? Today I've used.
As we know, we don't know that he did not keep a diary. Although there are several reports that have been. That were published at the time and then after his death in 1875 that sort of remembered him and recounted various stories of the way he would be just very exuberant and energetic in his studio. He was very constantly working, constantly sharing his photographs, constantly. So he was meeting with people. There's a great article by A.H. Wall, who's a friend of his and an artist and photographer, who talks about this one meeting he had with some of his colleagues in Rejlander and how he showed up with all these photographs and just laid them out on the table to share and to show them and to talk about them. So he was certainly sociable. He also had a lot of friendships within the theatrical community, because his wife Mary was an actress, and so it's presumed that that's how he really sort of knew a lot of the actors and members of the Wolverhampton and London theatrical world. And then with photography, he also was very connected with Julia Margaret Cameron and Lewis Carroll, and photographers that we probably are more familiar with than Rejlander himself. But he was actually someone that apparently encouraged them both in their early photographic explorations. And so that's something that's kind of interesting. He was very clearly not a hermit and not off on his own. He was very much engaged and had colleagues that he worked with and talked to, but he's somehow got forgotten about. But when you read these stories about him, they're incredibly specific, and they paint a really lively, engaged picture of him. And I think that's how he got the photographs as well, that he wasn't a quiet, still photographer. He would actually engage with the sitter and move them around and sort of get them into certain positions without them knowing about it, and just was a very playful, proactive photographer. I really wish we could have met him, but
I mean, judging by his photographs, I think he was fun.
Yes, yeah.
And he staged just all these children, and they play, and it's something very playful about everything he does.
Yeah, I think another of his friends even described him as a child among children. He was, he himself would, especially when he was photographing children, which was why he became known for that particular subject, but he would actually act out different, goofy games. Brilliant. And then get them to respond and get them to relax and sort of forget that they're in this situation that's sort of awkward, where you have this camera in the room and someone photographing you, and you're meant to stay still and things like that. So he really broke those boundaries too. That you can even see it in some of the photographs that he's in, because of course he and his wife are in many of the photographs, which is also a kind of remarkable thing. You can see his way of presenting himself in different gestures and expressions. He's just very emotive, and so that must have helped when he was trying to get someone else to do it for his camera.
So now let's go to Mary. What do we know? She was an actress. Yes. She was very beautiful.
Oh,
we know
yes.
that.
Yeah.
She worked in the studio with him.
Mm-hmm.
Do we know did they collaborate, or was she more of an assistant? Do we know anything of that?
Yeah, we do. We do know that she assisted him in making the sensitive plates. She assisted him in the darkroom, and we can kind of surmise that she did help him with several of the exposures that he's in. So there's one particularly, Did She, I think is one that's in the exhibition, where you see Rejlander himself behind the model. So she is the photographer of that particular picture. But I think it's just a wonderful story of collaboration, and what's striking is just the longevity of it. I mean, of course, their marriage, but also their seemingly kind of fluid way of working together. She being a lot of the times the model, but also being a supporter in terms of all the labor involved with running a photography studio, because there's a lot, obviously, that goes on behind the scenes, preparing the plates and processing the plates, making the prints, even just down to supplying water for the darkroom. I know she was involved with that and was helpful with that. So I like that the exhibition begins there, that it's not something that you discover later on in the story, that actually one of the first sections you encounter is called Oscar and Mary, and it shows the fact that they were very much involved in creating the pictures that he created, and that she was a frequent model, and that he kind of worked with her in the studio. And I like that idea of sort of starting off a retrospective on a male photographer right away, to say it wasn't just